Hello, my name is Mary Rose, and welcome to The Billion-Dollar Painting. Chances are we know that the first painting that will sell for $1 billion is already in existence. Every Thursday, this podcast asks, which one will it be? We turn over rocks and we study patterns in the most exclusive corners of the art market in search for our billion-dollar painting. As always, accompanying pictures and further reading for today's candidate can be found on the show website. On a warm summer evening, two figures stand out on the front porch of a suburban home. One figure is a young blonde woman, leaning back against the railing, wearing a pink bandeau top and high-waisted pink sports skirt. She doesn't look at her companion, a tall blonde man wearing a blue t-shirt and brown trousers. His legs are at odd angles as he half sits on the railing, but all of his attention is on her. We can only see half of his dimly illuminated face, but his left hand is raised to press against his own chest, almost indicating himself. To their left, there is a closed door and a closed window. The lights inside of the house are off. Nothing can be seen inside the house. The only source of light in this nighttime scene is the harsh glow of the overhead porch light. This description reads like the introduction to a movie. You might already be wondering what brought these two figures here. Some can see in it the awkwardness of a first date, or the end of a relationship. Clearly, communication has broken down. I've noticed in scholarship written by an older generation that there are a lot of allusions to sexual tension. They tend to be in the first date crowd, perhaps because she's wearing a revealing top and he seems so interested in her. Maybe she looks a little shy to them. But for women of my generation, there's almost this tendency to write about the body posture of a woman who clearly is not interested. She looks down, her body is turned away, she's not making herself available for conversation. And then they can also see the body posture of a man who is either mansplaining or just speaking about himself, the raised hand to the chest almost as if to say, well, I think, or have you thought about me? If you forget the slightly 1940s fashion, you could be forgiven for thinking it's a modern political piece from artists in the Me Too generation. Instead, it is the 1947 painting, Summer Evening, by American artist Edward Hopper. It should surprise no one that the painter who is sometimes affectionately called the introvert's favorite was himself a rather shy man. Born in Nyack, New York in 1882, Edward Hopper got immediate support from his family for his lifetime love of art. He studied briefly at both the Correspondence School of Illustrating in New York City and the New York School of Art until 1906. Hopper was a contemporary of Picasso, but his influences and interests were very different. Hopper followed the works of French painters Edgar Degas and Edouard Manet, and the American Impressionist William Merritt Chase. While these artists were by no means old-fashioned, they were not part of the new avant-garde, like the Fauves that Picasso adored. Hopper participated in a few exhibitions during the early 19-teens, first at the exhibition of independent artists in 1910, and then the famous Armory Show in 1913. The Armory Show is notorious now for exhibiting some of the most famous artists from the 19th and early 20th centuries. It's almost a laundry list of people you'll learn about in Art History 101. Edgar Degas, Eugène Delacroix, Vincent van Gogh, Paul Gauguin, Marcel Duchamp, Edvard Munch, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Paul Cézanne, Gustave Courbet, Mary Cassatt, Pablo Picasso, among others. Edward married Josephine Nivisayan, who he called Jo, a fellow artist, and it's due to her careful cataloging and note-taking that we know so much about Hopper's artwork. However, they didn't often see eye to eye. Jo was loud, bubbly, friendly, and controlling. Hopper was often cold and private. He often thought that she was being irrational. He hated when she tried to create narratives for his paintings. He said she was trying to turn him into Norman Rockwell. Some art historians have said that this disconnect in the Hopper marriage inspired some of the disconnected couples we've already seen in Summer's Evening and other Hopper paintings. While Jo was undoubtedly a huge influence on Hopper's work, the woman who really kickstarted Hopper's fame was Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the heiress, artist, and art patron. We haven't spoken much about patronage on this podcast, but for artists in the 20th century, the support of wealthy socialites and philanthropists was really key. Not only did these patrons help them to get established during their own lifetimes, they also founded many of the institutions that would catalog these artists in the timeline of art history and make them the great names that we know today. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was one such woman alongside Isabella Stewart Gardner and Peggy Guggenheim, all of whom amassed vast collections and founded the key American art institutions, the Whitney Museum, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and the Guggenheim Museum, respectively. Gertrude Vanderbilt was born in 1875. Her father was Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the heir to the Vanderbilt shipping and railroad empire built by his father. When Cornelius II took over the family business in 1885, he became the wealthiest man in America. Gertrude Vanderbilt attended the Art Student League of New York, a venerable institution in its own right, which boasted alumna such as Georgia O'Keeffe, Roy Lichtenstein, and Man Ray. Her favorite medium was sculpture, and she liked to work big. She studied previously in Paris under Andrew O'Connor and Auguste Rodin. Originally, she exhibited her artworks with a male pseudonym to avoid the stigma given to female artists and to a wealthy heiress, but she soon dropped the pretense. Some of her works of art can still be seen today, including the Memorial for the Founders of the Daughters of the American Revolution sculpture in Washington, D.C., as well as the Washington Heights Inwood War Memorial, which can be seen in New York City, right where Broadway and St. Nicholas Avenue meet West 168th Street. Like the daughters of European royal families, Gertrude was expected to make an appropriate match, and she did in 1896, and she married Harry Payne Whitney. The Whitney clan were prominent socialites, horse breeders, and political advisors who had risen to prominence during the Gilded Age. Gertrude continued sculpting, but she and Harry also collected a staggering amount of artwork. In particular, they loved modern and the avant-garde, and they loved American artists. During the 19th and early 20th century, many collectors didn't pay much attention to American artists. The center of art was thought to be Europe, and in particular Paris. America was considered somewhat of an artistic backwater, and very few American artists received any sort of international recognition. If they did, they were at least maybe provincial landscape painters. Certainly they didn't have the kind of sophisticated range that European modernists were thought to have. In 1908, the newly minted Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney founded the Whitney Studio Gallery to showcase her own artwork alongside other prominent artists of the time. She also expanded into the 1914 Whitney Studio Club, a society for artists to mingle and exhibit their work. This kind of club had already existed in Europe, although it was somewhat new, but Whitney brought it to her beloved community of American artists. She used her vast fortune to provide housing for some of the artists and even transportation if they wanted to learn in Europe or exhibit there. One of these artists was Edward Hopper. He had two exhibitions at the Whitney Studio Club, one in 1920 and one in 1922. He began to be represented by Wren galleries, and during the 1920s he created some of his most famous artworks. One of them, a painting called House by the Railroad, which he completed in 1925, became the first ever acquisition for the Museum of Modern Art when it was opened in 1930. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney became one of the most outspoken and vocal supporters of American art. In 1929, Whitney offered the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art 700 paintings and sculptures of modern and American art, as well as a sizable donation to build a suitable wing. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, which had been founded in 1870 with the mission statement to bring art and culture to the American people, declined, because they simply did not exhibit American art. To Whitney, who had herself been educated both in Europe and America and had developed this fondness for the American artists of New York, this was absolutely unacceptable. Whitney chose Juliana Force, her own private secretary, to become the administrator of her own institution, the Whitney Museum of American Art. While Force was running the museum, Gertrude continued sculpting. She had 3 children until Harry Whitney died in 1930. Her most famous work of art today is probably the Titanic Memorial in Washington, D.C., which was made during her tenure with the Women's Titanic Memorial Association. Whitney's brother, Alfred Vanderbilt, had purchased tickets to sail on the Titanic. but had been unable to make the cruise for business reasons. It was a close call for her family, and she lost many friends in the disaster, so it was very close to her heart. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney herself died in 1942, right at the time when the center of the art world was beginning to shift. Avant-garde artists had fled Europe in droves, many of them arriving in New York City. Her patronage had made these careers possible, an effect that would come to fruition in the coming decades with the first American-led art movements, like abstract expressionism and pop art. Edward Hopper's paintings are a precursor to that moment, and in many ways, in part because they are so quintessentially American. He painted what he called, quote, America's mongrel architecture, unquote, rather than the splendor of European cities. He was overall fascinated by the mundane. Lights and shadows in empty rooms or vacant buildings were his favorite subjects. To the end, as I just said, he had been inspired by Impressionist artists, and he called himself an Impressionist. And it's this mundanity in his artwork that many people find so appealing about his paintings. People can read all sorts of symbolism and meaning into his paintings, just like the reading that I gave of our painting today, Summer Evening. His paintings are almost like outtakes from a movie scene, but where another painter might paint the middle of a scene with the animation and gesture that you would expect, Hopper instead paints the in-between moments. We often wish, when we're looking at a Hopper, that the characters would have some sort of thought bubble or speech bubble, and we create our own narratives and our own characters that we project onto his figures. In an era of loud, buoyant modernism, fraught with action, with motion and emotion, Hopper's work is quiet and still. Hopper is most well known for his painting The Nighthawks, one of the most enigmatic paintings of the 20th century, in which a group of people are scattered throughout a diner at night, in each other's vicinity, and yet entirely alone. Part of what people find so appealing about The Nighthawks, and also about Summer Evening, is that the viewer could almost just be passing by and glancing up at this scene. It's our action that kind of turns it into a very interesting, almost stage performance for us. But most of us have seen something like this in our everyday lives. We've walked past diners and looked at people and wondered what they were thinking. We've walked past people having discussions on porches and maybe sometimes thought if we should intervene. But overall, it's a very voyeuristic kind of attitude that he puts us in. In the same way, there's something very comparable in Nighthawks and in Summer Evening because they are nighttime scenes. Edward Hopper liked to paint nighttime scenes because they gave an interesting opportunity to paint light. The lighting of Nighthawks is so fluorescent, it is yellow and green, but it's all coming and spilling out of this diner. The diner itself is the only lit thing, because it's one of those great American inventions, 24-hour food or coffee or whatever you need. But the rest of it, the rest of the painting is filled with black, just with closed shop windows and no street lamps outside. It becomes very claustrophobic. It's almost the same way with our painting, because in Summer Evening, it's a nighttime scene and there's only one source of light, and so the rest of the painting, outside of the porch, is almost shut off. We can't see into it. These are common themes in the roughly 366 paintings that he completed during his lifetime. This was, in many ways, the American condition, especially during the Depression of the 1930s and the wartime tension of the 1940s. Hopper became influential to an entire generation of American artists. In 1931, Mark Rothko painted a nearly identical copy of Hopper's work Chop Suey, which Rothko entitled Composition 1. The original painting, Chop Suey, recently sold in a Christie's auction in November of 2018 for $91.9 million. In 1952, Hopper represented the United States at the Venice Biennale, but his rising star was quickly beginning to fade. The decade after Mark Rothko had copied Chop Suey, he was exhibiting his iconic abstract multiform paintings. He had moved on entirely. Jackson Pollock made his first famous strips during the late 1940s. Abstract expressionism was on the rise, and by the time Edward Hopper died in 1967, pop art was on the center stage. And yet no one completely forgot Hopper. At his wife Jo's death in 1968, she donated some 3,000 Hopper paintings, drawings, etchings, and watercolors to the Whitney Museum. To give you some idea, the Whitney Museum today has somewhere in the neighborhood of 21,000 works of art total, making these Hopper artworks around 14% of their entire collection. Other institutions quickly got on board with these art collectors who were ferrying all these Hopper paintings off to a new generation of art museums. The Metropolitan Museum of Art eventually caved in and collected a Hopper for their glowing American wing, and prominent collections of Hopper artwork can be found in Des Moines and in Chicago. In the world of American art, Edward Hopper was king. Edward Hopper graced the cover of Time magazine twice. First with his own face on the cover of the December 24th, 1956 edition, with a cover story about his life and his artwork and his influence. The second was in the August 25th, 1995 edition. The cover story for that magazine was 20th Century Blues. According to that article's author, Robert Wright, by the 1990s, it was clear that something was very wrong in America. Americans had abundant free time, they had access to more information than any previous generation in history, poverty was on a downswing, crime wasn't even as bad as it had been in previous decades. Nowadays, this is called the pre-9/11 bubble. But instead of happiness, Americans experienced record high rates of depression. Wright talked about and compared this to the Unabomber's terrorist brand of nihilism, and said that this was evidence for this growing sense of loneliness and solitude in modern life. And for that article, the Times chose Edward Hopper's artwork, a painting entitled Automat, to accompany the article on the cover. Automat depicts a woman sitting alone in a public place, another quintessential Hopper theme, and it's currently housed in the Des Moines Arts Center. Of the few Edward Hopper paintings that are left in private hands, only a handful of them have human figures in them. While looking through Edward Hopper's repertoire to pick a painting for this podcast, I was seeing again and again these empty shop fronts with no people in them, or rooftops, or some kind of farmhouse landscapes. Hopper was perfectly happy to paint cityscapes and landscapes and sailboats and all of these other themes, but collectors sought out his figurative works above all. It's that sense of detachment and isolation in between characters that so many people find so appealing. Summer Evening is one of the last Edward Hopper paintings left in private hands, and its provenance is so murky that it's impossible to say who has held on to it since it was sold through the Wren galleries in the 1940s. In this case, I don't think that would hurt it much at auction. While provenance certainly matters, a work of art that hasn't seen commercial activity in 70 years is still going to provide interesting results at an auction, especially if the painting's current collector is revealed by the auction house as being someone famous, perhaps connected to the Whitneys or the Vanderbilts. Still, Summer Evening isn't a total stranger to the art market because it does have a surviving preparatory sketch. The sketch was formerly owned by actor Steve Martin before being sold for $225,000 at a Sotheby's auction in May of 2018. It is almost certain that his wife Jo modeled for the woman in the painting, since she modeled for so many of his figures. Between the sketch and the painting, the only real change to the composition is very telling. In the sketch, the woman's head is upturned towards the man. Somewhere in between putting charcoal to paper and putting paint to canvas, Hopper decided to close the woman off, to have her look down and away. In 2018, young people wait longer to date than they used to. They get married later, if at all. They're more likely to adopt dogs than they are to have babies in their 20s. In our painting today, Summer Evening, Hopper has captured a kind of persistent solitude that makes sense to a lot of Americans, especially in relationships. Most of us have been either that woman, self-isolating, turning away from others, disengaging from social contact, lost in our own thoughts, or we've been that man, making some sort of declaration or plea to someone who's connected from us, attempting to reach through a kind of veil. Paintings become expensive when there's the perfect recipe of supply and demand. The supply of Hopper paintings is limited because of how many people have attempted to collect them, but they're all just snapped up by museums. Mark Porter, the spokesman for Christie's, implied that chop suey was collected by someone connected to an institution. He said that the painting, he hoped it would be exhibited again soon, with a kind of nod and a wink. If chop suey is collected by an institution, the supply is just continuing to dwindle. The demand can come from a lot of places. I think a new generation of millennial art collectors are perfectly primed for Hopper's work because of how it speaks to contemporary issues, even after all this time. While millennials have a rather persistent reputation as being very anti-luxury consumerists as a whole, you can turn into any magazine and see something about how millennials are killing the diamond industry or what have you, or the napkin industry. That shouldn't be any surprise to anyone that some people in their 20s and 30s are going to become, and are already becoming, extremely wealthy. And when people become wealthy, they look for art as symbols of their status. An artist who is known as one of the most celebrated American artists, who is connected to the royalty of the American Gilded Age, would be primed for such a collector, especially if that collector had a kind of nationalist view. But as one of the most celebrated American artists, I also think it's time for Hopper's artwork to be primed for the international market. Since the preparatory sketch was sold just this year, we might be seeing Summer Evening come to the market sometime soon. Sometimes you see these kinds of patterns where a work of art that hasn't seen the light of day for a while has a kind of introductory work of art attached to it to prime the market. If Summer Evening does make its debut anytime soon, I wouldn't be surprised if it were one of the few Hoppers to leave the United States altogether. Edward Hopper's artwork is American, but he knew it himself when he said in an interview that he painted, quote, the whole human condition. It's that quality that could make Summer Evening the billion-dollar painting. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to subscribe and leave a 5-star review. It helps more people find their way to the show. You can also find more information about Summer Evening and other works of art by visiting the website billiondollarpodcast.com. You can also find us on Twitter at billionpainting, and now on Instagram at thebilliondollarpainting. You can also email us if you want to get in contact at thebilliondollarpainting@gmail.com. See you next week.